All right, today I move on to the beginning of a series of lectures on these topics. Today I start with street gangs and prison gangs. And then today I won't get to lowriders, drug cartels, or prison industrial complex. Those will be the lectures that will follow. So today focus on street gangs and prison gangs. One of my goals in going over these is to help you distinguish the difference between a street gang, a prison gang, lowriders, and drug cartels. And so yeah, that should be part of the focus, is distinguishing one from the other. So we've talked about immigration before and how there's been a backlash to each wave of immigration in US history. And part of those, part of the backlash and part of the stereotypes of the different immigrant groups has been things like that they're violent, that they're prone to crime. And even though they don't represent immigrant groups in their entirety, there have been street gangs associated with these different groups. All, not only immigrant groups, but all lower class groups have been stereotyped as rough and tough gangsters. Whether it was the Irish in the mid-19th century, Italians at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, African Americans throughout US history, Mexicans, well, throughout the 19th and 20th century, and Salvadorans, probably from the late 1980s to the present. And I mentioned here that Black people are not, in their majority, are not immigrants, but it's not about being immigrants. It's really about poverty, segregation, and racism. And like I mentioned before in the lecture on immigration, even these groups that we think of as white ethnic groups today were portrayed as not as mainstream white at the time when they were arrived. That doesn't happen until after World War II with suburbanization. These are just pictures representing the different groups. This first one is not a real picture. It's from the movie Gangs of New York. But, you know, representing Irish street gang members to the Italian mob, to Mexican-American cholos, to MS13 street gang members in more recent years. A little bit of background before I get into some of these specific things is when it comes to Mexican-American street gangs, the earliest ones we know of were, how do I put it, were started in the 1930s and then became very visible in the 1940s in the context of World War II and the Zoot Suit riots and all that. But these street gangs were very different from those today, or even in recent decades, because they were less formal, less official, more of a kind of more of a fad that people went through at some, you know, say in their teenage years. Not to say all those things don't still happen, but especially so back then, when they didn't necessarily, when they were less likely to have, where membership was very loose, and the use of the word gang didn't have the connotations that it has today. People used to talk about, like, let's get the gang together. It didn't have the connotations of being scary criminal entities that the word gang has today. It had different connotations. And so, yeah. Again, when it comes to Mexican American gangs, we talk about pachucos that we've already learned about in the 1940s and 50s. Then after that, they started calling them vatos locos, the crazy guys, in the 1960s and 70s. And then after that, they refer to them as cholos from the 1980s. Right here, I'm a little conflicted because I want to say 80s and 90s, but then again, I don't know that people have come up with a new term. And so I'll just connect it to the present. So beginning with pachucos, there were many people who participated in Zoot Zoot culture or Pachuco culture and were not street gang members. With that, in fact, probably like 95% were not street gang members. With that said, the ones who were street gang members were associated or would be more likely to embrace the term Pachuco. After the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles, most Mexican Americans distanced themselves from the Zoot Zoot and Pachuco culture. But the people that were identified with it more strongly kind of went the other way. They embraced it and kind of embraced the notoriety that came with being considered a Pachuco. We learned that Latinos in general, and including Mexican Americans, served in the US military during World War II, despite the reputation of Pachucos being draft dodgers. When they came back from the service, whether it be especially World War II, but even after that with Korea, and even after that with Vietnam, they came back and adopted their new style was less about the zoot suit and a little bit more about the US Army uniform. And so then they start wearing khaki pants, they start wearing white t-shirts, and instead of the long ducktail haircut, they start shaving their heads like in boot camp. And so in a certain way, it was a kind of a repudiation, a kind of a way of making themselves less victims, and at the same time kind of embracing some of their veteran status and history and so forth. These street gangs, were relatively small, although in the 1950s, sort of after the Zoot Suit riots, there was a continuation of kind of the cracking down on these perceived street gangs. So it led to a growth of people in prison that were members of these street gangs, especially in California. There were some Pachucos who, especially after the Zoot Suit riots, when they tried to distance themselves from Pachuco culture and street gangs, instead started embracing lowrider culture. And so lowrider culture is explicitly, initially a culture to get away from street gang association and violence, even though today they get conflated still. Where during World War, well, maybe I'm trying to decide how much to talk about that because it relates more to the lowriders. But the point is that in the 1940s and 50s, there's a split between those that embrace street gang membership and those that try to distance themselves from it, some of whom get into lowriding. And so, you know, again, I'll just touch on some of it right now. In World War II, they stopped making new cars. So more people, there was more work for people fixing cars, whether it's mechanically or body work. And so a lot of youth found opportunity in that line of work. And that also provided opportunity for them to get their hands on vehicles and fix them up. Yeah. All right, in order for me to explain Mexican-American street gangs, it's helpful for me to talk about kind of where I grew up and how they worked then and there. So in Southern California, there are Mexican-American street gangs for pretty much most urban and many suburban cities and neighborhoods. And so I grew up in the city of Inglewood. So in Inglewood, the local Mexican-American street gang was called Inglewood 13. And so next door was Lenox 13 and Culver City 13, Santa Monica 13, and so forth. Every city had their own 13 within the bigger, greater Los Angeles. And so if there were a Mexican-American street gang in Eau Claire, it's possible it would be called Eau Claire 13. That doesn't exist, it's just an example. The street gangs have subgroups, sometimes referred to as cliques. The subgroups can either be geographic. So like if a street gang has a big area, they might have North Side, Inglewood 13, or in South Side or West Side or East Side. Or there's some African-American street gangs that are like the Rolling 60s, the Rolling 40s, the Rolling 50s. And so they're saying all the street numbers that are in the 60s are their area. All the streets that are, you know, in the 40s, you know, 41st Street, 49th Street, and so forth are their territory. So sometimes it's geographic, and sometimes it's also generational. So for example, in Inglewood 13, they had a subgroup that was older than me, and they called themselves the Rascals. They were the Inglewood 13 Rascals. Then there were the guys that were my age. They called themselves the Dukes. They were the Inglewood 13 Dukes. Then there was a generation after that. They called themselves the Tiny Locos. Inglewood 13 Tiny Locos, and so forth. So they can be generational, they could be geographic. Now, street gangs, their biggest enemies, their biggest focus is on fighting each other street gangs. So even, you know, like right next door to Inglewood 13 would be Lenox 13 and Culver City 13 and Santa Monica 13. And their biggest enemies are each other, even though they're all 13s. Their biggest enemies are each other, not street gangs of other racial groups, and not kind of people that are not involved in street gangs. Their targets, their enemies are each other. There's an author named Luis Valdez who wrote a book called Always Running. He referred to this as social suicide, because the people they want to kill are the people that are the most like them. It's another Mexican-American street gang member from the neighborhood next door. How does this relate to prison gangs? And what's the interconnection between prison gangs and street gangs? All right, so the Mexican Mafia is a prison gang that started in California in 1957. That is where the number 13 comes from. The number 13 is the 13th letter of the alphabet, the M. That is a shortcut for the Mexican Mafia. It was started in 1957 by those mostly LA street gang members who were put into prison with long or life sentences. And then they organized, they got together to protect Mexican Americans from basically from whites and blacks in the prison system. Yes. The letter M, the 13th letter of the alphabet. Yeah. So they're associated with the number 13. They're also referred to as La M, the M. They're also associated with the black hand tattoo that you can see here. Now, even though it's called the Mexican Mafia did not come from Mexico. The Mexican Mafia was created by Mexican Americans in the United States. And they were not immigrants. They were US born, and I think they were inspired by the Italian mob, by calling them, with both the Black Hand and calling themselves Mafia. Now, in prison, the Mexican Mafia, at least when it started, what it would say it would do is it would protect ethnic Mexicans, initially all Mexican Americans, from other racial groups, from whites and blacks in particular. And it ended up getting really big as the Latino, especially Mexican and ethnic Mexican population grew in the state of California. And then other groups started align with it or align against it. So I mentioned that the street gangs, a lot of street gangs have the number 13 after their name. That does not mean that they are prison gangs. It does not mean that if they go to prison, they are now members of the Mexican Mafia. It's a little bit more nuanced. Anyone that is Mexican or Mexican or Latino background today, if they go to prison, they are expected to back up basically their racial group. And so Mexican American street gang members go to prison and they're assumed that they need to back up the Mexican Mafia and their racial group. Again, that doesn't mean that they are members of the Mexican Mafia. Being in a street gang is not blood in, blood out, but being in a prison gang is. Meaning the idea that you need to kill someone to get in and that the only way out is for you to get killed. Street gangs are not like that, despite what the media tells you. But prison gangs are. And so they basically pressure everyone to back them up when they do big things, big movements or whatever. But that doesn't make them members. The members are the ones who can't get out, can't leave. Yeah. Now, in the case of the Mexican Mafia, in like 11 years later, in 1968, some members of the Mexican Mafia split up from the Mexican Mafia and created another Mexican-American prison gang in California called Nuestra Familia. Nuestra Familia is associated with the number 14 for the letter N, the 14th letter of the alphabet. And they are also referred to as Northerners, norteños in Spanish. And so at that point, the Mexican Mafia also got known as Sureños, Southerners. Even though there are actually Sureños in both Southern California and Northern California, but there are only Norteños in Northern California. So yeah, Nuestra Familia is a lot smaller, but at any rate, that's kind of what it is. There's also the letter, like I mentioned, the Mexican Mafia is sometimes referred to as M, the Spanish pronunciation for the letter M. But now they've also been associated with the word or the letter S, especially the expression ese. Ese is an expression that goes back to the Pachucos. That was just simply a way to say like, hey man, hey dude, hey guy. They would say like, hey ese, come over here. Hey, you know. And so ese is something that goes back to the Pachucos. But once Nuestra Familia was created, they try to distance themselves from that expression as well of the ese, because it's now associated with Sureños. There is a African-American prison gang called the Black Guerrilla Family in California, and they are affiliated with Nuestra Familia. There is a white prison gang called the Aryan Brotherhood, and they are affiliated with the Mexican Mafia. And so just the number of Latinos in the state of California and in the prison system got so large that the other racial groups eventually ended up having to ally with the different Mexican-American street gangs. Associations with the other Aryan Brotherhood include the swastika, the letters AB, sometimes referred to as ABers, the three-leaf clover, the 666. Those are just things associated with them. What about MS13? MS13, Mara SalvaTrucha, is something that started as a street gang, but has gone on to become something else, something bigger. The street gang, MS, Mara SalvaTrucha, got started in the 1980s in Los Angeles. And I've mentioned before how when the government dismantled the militant groups of the 1960s, like the Black Panthers and the Brown Berets, They inadvertently helped create the Bloods, the Crips, from these youth that didn't have kind of this positive organization to lead them away from crime. Actually, that's a bit of an aside. Sorry about that. I've also mentioned that if we go back and interview the people, or if we go back to read the interviews that have been done with the people who founded street gangs, they always talked about basically segregation and racism, how they felt that they needed to create the street gangs to protect themselves in order to be able to step out of the areas that they were segregated into. And essentially that was against white youth in particular, who would beat them up for not sticking to the segregated area they were supposed to. But when it comes to MS, something very different happened there. In the 1980s, there was civil wars happening in Central America, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua. And so there were a lot of people coming to the United States to flee those civil wars. So Salvadorans were among them, came to the United States. And when they arrived to the United States, they would arrive to predominantly Mexican American or ethnic Mexican neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color. And it turns out the United States in the 1980s was also having its crack epidemic, and the rise of street gangs. Street gangs were not created in the 1980s, but street gangs reached their highest numbers in US history in the 1980s and 1990s. Since then, they've gone down dramatically, even though you wouldn't know that from the media. But street gangs were at their height in the 80s and 90s. When the Salvadoran people would arrive to Los Angeles, they'd arrive to these neighborhoods where Mexican American and Black street gangs were at their height, and they basically got bullied and robbed and stuff like that. And so they created their own street gang to protect themselves from the Mexican American and Black street gangs that were targeting them as easy targets. When I was in high school in the early 90s, they were not a 13 yet. They were around. People knew of them as MS. When I was in high school, Inglewood 13 members would make fun of MS as kind of, they thought of them as a joke, a small street gang that didn't have a lot of power. But that definitely changed. After the 1990s, when street gang membership across the country declined dramatically, MS was the only street gang that continued to grow. So that most street gangs went down in membership and MS instead grew. It's at that point, towards the late 1990s, I think it was in the late 90s, that MS was big enough that it became affiliated with the Mexican Mafia, became a 13. What does Mara SalvaTrucha mean? Mara means group. Salva for Salvadorian. Trucha means to be on guard or on alert. And so Mara SalvaTrucha is a Salvadorian group that's on guard. In the late 90s, early 2000s, the US government also tried to eradicate MS-13 by deporting anyone who wasn't a US citizen. So they deported a lot of MS-13 members to El Salvador, MS-13 and 18th Street. And inadvertently, they ended up exporting MS13 and 18th Street to El Salvador and to Central America in general, especially El Salvador and Honduras, where Enrique came from. And there they exploded in growth. It is there that they became something bigger and different than a street gang. So they attempted to deport them. They instead expanded their reach. They just grew in El Salvador. In El Salvador, they are more than a street gang. They're organized crime in general. Within El Salvador, they play the role of something like a cartel. They gained a lot of power. Oh, do I have it here? Yes, I do. All right. They gained a lot of power. And we learned from Enrique's journey how much power they attained, where the governments of those countries have a hard time containing them. And this street gang membership ended up, even after the civil wars were over, then the street gang members are the ones that were causing people to want to flee their country to the United States or elsewhere. And so, like in Enrique's journey, we learn about MS13. Right now, I'm telling you, that it was made in the United States. It has to do with violence and poverty, drugs and fear. And, they, try to prevent, they're a big reason why refugees leave Central America to come to the United States. And they try to keep young people, especially, in their control. Something different happened in El Salvador in recent years with their president, Bukele. In March of 2022, Bukele started what he calls a state of exception. It was a period where basically he didn't have to follow the Constitution. He could just arrest anyone he wanted with any reason he felt was good enough. There were lots of people that were arrested and thrown in jail simply for their tattoos. He arrested 75,000 people. These people did not get trials. They were tried similar to the Sleepy Lagoon defendants in mass, where they would, if the court can fit 30 people, then 30 people would be brought in. And then they just say, okay, you're all guilty. You're going to jail for 20 years or indefinitely. And they put them in this new high security prison. Now there's pros and cons to this. On the one hand, people in El Salvador feel safer than they have in 30 years, 25 years or so. There's a lot of people right now that are said, can now go on vacation within their own country to the beautiful lakes and rivers and so forth. And they're like, 5 years ago, we couldn't come here because this was controlled by MS13 or 18th Street. On the other hand, there were clearly many people who were put in prison who were not MS13 street gang members. So in the process of trying to get all the street gang members, they also put a lot of people who were not street gang members, but that they suspected were. And so there's a lot of innocent people that were caught up in this and can't get out. And there's no process for them to get out. Another thing is that Bukele is also showing signs of being kind of more dictatorial, in that El Salvador didn't have re-elections, but he found a loophole to get re-elected last year in 2024. And then now he is getting along well with our President Trump, and now they're starting to send immigrants from Venezuela to El Salvador. And there's also signs of innocent people getting caught in that effort. And the immigrants that are being sent there are being sent there for similar reasons. They're saying that they are members of the Venezuelan street gang Tren de Aragua, and that the people that they're sending to El Salvador prison are members of Tren de Aragua. But again, there's very clear signs that a lot of people being sent there are not members of Tren de Aragua. So Tren de Aragua is the new, kind of the new boogeyman to scare people about immigrants, especially from Venezuela. Yeah, so MS13 is its own category, because there is no leader of MS13 worldwide, but there are MS13 members or cliques in El Salvador, in Mexico, in many states of the United States, especially on both coasts, in LA and Washington, D.C. in particular. There's some MS13 in Canada, but there isn't any one leader that controls them all. They're pretty independent. And so they act as a street gang in some places, and in other places they act a little more like a cartel, especially within El Salvador. Another similar thing with this notion of over policing, part of the effort to deport MS13 street gang members in LA in the 1990s was, there was a police department called the Rampart police station, the Rampart division of Los Angeles Police. They're the ones that worked I think it's called the Pico Union, or the MacArthur Park area of Los Angeles, where most where MS13 was based out of. And Rampart was found to have been planting evidence in hundreds of instances in order to build up rap sheets for who they believed were MS13 members, to get them, to be able to charge them with bigger crimes and then get them deported. And so we see this happening over and over again. We see in Los Angeles in the 1990s, Rampart police planting evidence on people. Then we see Bukele in El Salvador. I keep wanting to say this because I heard it recently, and it's Bukele arrested 110% of MS13 members in El Salvador, so that he tried to arrest them all, and in the process caught people who weren't. And then now we see President Trump doing the same thing of going overboard in claiming people are members of Tren de Aragua and sending them to El Salvador. to that same prison.